Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about biochemistry and some of the chemical molecules that are important to life. So if you've got your It's Learning quiz open, you can answer the questions kind of as we go along here. The first element that I want to talk about is the most important one, carbon. We are, as they say on Star Trek, carbon-based life forms. So carbon is is an atom that is so essential to life that if we want to find life on any other planet, anywhere else in the solar system, anywhere else in the galaxy, the universe, one of the things that we really look for is a carbon signature, because every single thing that's alive on our planet has carbon as its basis. It's a very special atom, and the reason it's so special is because it has four valence electrons that allow it to make a humongous variety of very strong bonds. So if you think about all the complicated structural shapes that are the molecules that make up our bodies, everything from our DNA to our proteins to lipids and carbohydrates and to various sugars, all of those molecules have carbon as their basis for the most part. The carbon allows these molecules to be so many different shapes and so many different lengths and structures. It's really an amazing atom. So that's really what we have to thank for life. So let's take a look here. Here's a few structures that are built out of carbon. As you'll notice, it can make chains. It can make all sorts of different various shapes. It can make rings, and it's because it's capable of making those four different bonds in various different orientations that it can link together to build these bigger molecules. So when I'm talking about large molecules, the word for that is a macromolecule. These are molecules that are made up of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of smaller molecules. Now, in order to build a macromolecule, it is done through a process known as polymerization. So you want to check that on your quiz there. We make macromolecules, large compounds, by joining together smaller ones, and that process is called polymerization. Okay. Now, monomers are smaller units that are joined together in order to make these polymers, which are the larger compounds that are made out of the monomers. Now, we'll talk about a couple of those as we go here. There's four major groups of macromolecules in your body and in all life. And here they are. We have carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And we're going to talk about each of these as we go here, so you'll be able to answer that question on your quiz as you're following along. Let's take a look at the building blocks here. So I'll leave this up for a few moments here because it's going to help you answer one of your questions on your quiz. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids are all built out of different monomers, the single individual units that make them up. So carbohydrates are built out of monosaccharides, various small single sugars. Proteins are built out of these units known as amino acids. And lipids are built out of things known as fatty acids or glycerol. Nucleic acids are built out of units known as nucleotides, and we're going to talk quite a bit about those in the days to come here when we get into genetics and things like that, because we'll find out those are really important components of our DNA. So let's take them all in step here as we go. First off, the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, and they're found in loads of foods that we eat because they're the primary source of energy that our bodies utilize. So when you think about eating food, you think, oh, I need carbs, or an athlete says, I want a carb load. They're trying to take in a bunch of carbohydrates in order to have some energy to use to burn when they're exercising. So carbohydrates are really, one of their main uses is just as a source of energy. Okay. Plants, some animals and other organisms also will use them for some structural purposes sometimes, mostly plants. And it's also a place that plants can store energy as well in the form of carbohydrates. If you think about a potato is almost entirely carbohydrates, so a plant can store up energy there to use at a later time. Here's a picture of the monosaccharides, or the single sugar molecules, that are essentially what we would call a simple sugar or simple carbohydrate. So these are glucose and fructose, and you can see there's single little ring molecules there. Bunch of oxygens, hydrogens, those are carbons in that ring structure. These things can be bonded together to make larger carbohydrates. So sucrose is made up of a glucose and a fructose, which are both two monosaccharides, and then that makes sucrose what's known as a disaccharide. In other words, there's two simple sugars joined together to make one, right? And then, of course, we can have things like polysaccharides that are even more. But these are all technically carbohydrates when we talk about it. So your body, and we'll get more into this later, when you use the energy that's bound up inside of these carbohydrates, you can burn sugar, like what you would consider sucrose, glucose, really rapidly. Like it's in a form that your body can use like instantaneously. These longer chain carbohydrates, like what you might find inside of a potato or something like that, they need to be broken down first, essentially into glucose, before your body can utilize them for energy. So they last as a longer energy source, and they're maybe not quite so instantaneous as opposed to like if you were to just eat a couple of teaspoons full of sugar from the counter, you'd get pretty excited real quick, right? So here's another picture of that disaccharide. So you've got the two molecules, the glucose and the fructose, combined together, joined. So it's a slightly larger carbohydrate. It's a disaccharide. A polysaccharide can be much, much larger. These macromolecules are stuck together by all these monosaccharides. So there's a glucose molecule right there, and it's combined on a starch. So that starch is that much longer chain of known as a polysaccharide. Okay, like we said already, animals will store excess sugar in a polysaccharide called glycogen. Plants will use things like starches to store up their sugars, to store those things up. Cellulose is actually something that gives plants their strength and their rigidity. It's the structural part of the tree. Let's move on to the next molecule here. The next one is the lipid. And lipids you would know probably as fats. So fats, oils, waxes, these are all forms of lipids. They're molecules, again, that are made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms all bonded together. These are polymers made up of all these fatty acids, which are the monomer. So monomer, individual fatty acids, are combined to build this much larger molecule. So you can see a picture of a lauric acid down here, and you can see this big long chain of carbons with hydrogens dangling off all the sides. This is a fat. So I know you've probably heard of some different types of fat in terms of diet. In terms of eating and on the backs of food packaging, you'll oftentimes see things called saturated fats or unsaturated fats or trans fats. It is kind of important, like somewhat the differences between those. I don't want to get into it too much, but saturated fats and trans fats are typically pretty unhealthy for you, with trans fats maybe being even worse than saturated fats. The difference really has to do with the chemical bonds that are inside of them. So saturated fats and trans fats, their shape structurally looks a lot like the picture that you see there of the lauric acid. They're much straighter in shape, and because of that, they can pack together more tightly, and that usually makes them solid at room temperature, and especially in the case of a saturated fat. And because they're solid at room temperature, they have a greater tendency to clog up our arteries and cause what we call bad cholesterol, or LDL. Now, where do you find those things like saturated fats? They're in any kind of a fatty substance that might be solid at room temperature, but they're also in things like milk and cream, a lot of dairy products, coconut oil. Red meat contains saturated fats, your dairy products. So they're in a lot of stuff that we eat, right? Trans fats are artificially made. So what they do is they'll take a liquid fat and kind of make it semi-solid by bubbling gas through it, and then it causes it to somewhat solidify a little bit. So it's done for food processing in the food industry. They're not really a natural thing so much, and really the FDA has tried to steer us away from those because we know that they're really bad for people. They definitely are bad for our arteries, bad for our heart health. So we try to stay away from trans fats and saturated fats. So that leaves us with unsaturated fats. So unsaturated fats, because of the way their bonds are, have kind of a kink in their structure. They're sort of bent. So they're less likely to kind of pack together, and they tend to stay oily even at room temperature. They don't solidify very easily. So unsaturated fats are in things like olive oil, fish oil, sunflower oil, things like that. You could do a search online and find lots of them, and they tend to help out our good cholesterol, as opposed to making our LDL much worse. Now, don't think that you can get by without any fats at all, because your body needs fats to survive. So a completely fat-free diet is kind of a terrible thing, because everything from your cell membranes to your energy storage relies on these things. Literally, the membrane that surrounds your cells is a phospholipid bilayer. It's two layers of fats, and those fats are what's holding your cells together, and it's what's controlling what gets in and out of your cells. So you absolutely have to have lipids in your diet. You can't stop eating them altogether. But it would be pretty hard, especially here in America, where we have so much high-fat food around for us to eat just about everywhere. So some foods here that are rich in fats, like cheese and butter and nuts and seeds and avocados and things like that, they're high in fat. So even eating too much of the better fat foods is not necessarily a good thing. We need to limit ourselves to those things. So eat a heart-healthy diet, right? So lipids, still important. Don't stop eating them. All right, let's move on to the next group, nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are made up of H, O, N, and C, and P, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. So these are polymers. They're long chains of things that are assembled by individual pieces or monomers called nucleotides. So you'll see a picture of that here in a second. Now, nucleic acids are super duper important to all living creatures because they are literally the code for life. They're what makes up our genetic material. This is DNA and RNA. Hence, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. So this is literally your genetic material. This is the code for what you are. So we need these things, right? Let's look at how they're formed here and how they're built. We'll spend a lot more time actually talking about how the individual pieces are put together and that polymerization that is done there. But if you look at this schematic drawing here of a DNA molecule, you'll notice that there's kind of two sides to it. There's a blue side on the right and a blue side on the left, and then there's these colored pieces in between. The two side pieces, the blue pieces, are the two sides of the ladder. If you've seen a DNA structure before, this has just got a little more detail in it. You've got some little carbon chains in there, some little sugars. You've got some phosphorus there, some phosphates. You've got some oxygens in there. You'll notice some hydrogens dangling off. Don't get too hung up on all that. But what you can definitely notice is that those P's, those phosphate groups, they alternate with that little ring structure, which is the sugar. And they go phosphate, sugar, kind of all the way down one side, and the other side does the exact same thing. As you're looking at that, you'll notice that off of those little rings, those little sugars, there's another little piece dangling off that's colored, and it's got a letter in it. There's some with a G, some with a T, some with an A, some with a C. Those are the actual bases of your DNA. That's the actual code. So the rungs of the ladder are sort of holding the whole structure together, but the code are those nitrogen bases that are in between there. And they're bonded together with some weak hydrogen bonds that are holding them, the G's to the C's and the T's to the A's, and it's always like that. You'll notice that the T's and the A's have 2 bonds holding them, and the G's and the C's have 3 holding them together. That's the way it works, so that it comes together structurally in the appropriate fashion. Those T, G, C, and A, those letters, they stand for the chemical molecules. So it's sort of like a shorthand for that. So we have adenine and thymine and guanine and cytosine are their actual names. But we can just refer to them as G, C, A, and T. Those are the bases. Let's see. The other big difference here that you'll want to note, while this is a picture of DNA, which is double-stranded and contains deoxyribose sugar, which is in its name, deoxyribonucleic acid, RNA contains ribose sugar, which is why it's called ribonucleic acid, and it's only a single piece of the ladder. There's not another half stuck on there. So we'll talk more about that later, but those are our two types of nucleic acid, and a nucleotide is just a piece of one of those nitrogenous bases combined with a sugar and a phosphate group. So it's like one little piece of that. Okay, let's move on to proteins. Proteins are made up of nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And everybody knows that you need some proteins in your body, right? But what you may not recognize is what they're made up of or just how many uses they have. So these things are bigger molecules that are made up of a monomer called an amino acid. And you might have heard of the word amino acids before, and you might even know that they're pretty essential to life because the reason is that they make up proteins. So your amino acids, which you get from eating food, there are 20 different kinds of those. And they are able to combine in different patterns to make up to millions of different proteins. There's so many different ways you can put these things together. What I want to really point out here, and this is going to be a question on your quiz, is in amino acids, as well as in proteins in particular, is the structure determines everything. In other words, the shape of the molecule determines what it does. So in the case of a protein, it will have a specific shape which allows it to do something in your cell. Proteins are really important for your body because, well, in a sense, you're kind of a big bag of proteins. Your skin is proteins, your hair is proteins, your eyeballs are proteins, your fingernails are proteins. Like just about everything about you that isn't DNA is somehow constructed out of proteins. And these proteins carry out very important functions. In fact, your hormones are proteins. Enzymes that speed up and slow down reactions are proteins. So an awful lot of how your DNA controls what's going on inside your body is by coding for these specific proteins, which are made out of amino acids, which have specific shapes that give you the structure and the characteristics that you have. So why is your hair curly? Well, because the protein in your hair has a curled shape, and that's what gives you a curly hair. I've got straight hair, so the proteins in my hair have a straight sort of a structure. Why does your hair look a certain color? Well, I've got blonde hair, which just means that those tiny little molecules that make it up, those proteins, are shaped a certain way that the light, when it hits them, reflects back and it bounces back this blonde colored light. Same thing if you've got dark colored hair. It's just the shape of the protein that determines all of that. And proteins are built up of these things called amino acids. And here's a picture of a couple of these amino acids. We've got lysine, glutamine, aspartate, serine, alanine, cysteine. You can look at these here, and there's many, many more. But what you'll notice is that the tops of them are all really similar, aren't they? Right? The different part is this dangly bit that's poking off the bottom there, which is known as the R group. And that's really that group there that's stuck on there, that chemical group, is what gives them the characteristics that they have. And just like that, when they're all stuck together, the different shapes that you get give you the different purposes of the proteins and what the proteins can do. Okay, so I think we've answered all the questions. You guys can hit submit on your quiz, and you're all done.